it's a reported book. I interviewed more than 300 people for it. So I interviewed lots of people from The Apprentice, and they had complicated and varied responses to the impact of that show. A lot of them were very proud of the work they did on the show. And I have to say, I found the higher up the hierarchy they were, the more trouble they had disavowing the show, because they were like, we were making a hugely successful show on network television, working multiple hours. They wanted to brag about some of the things that had happened with it, but it was haunted by this aftermath. People who were more like cameramen and PAs were pretty straightforward about, like, we sold this guy to the world. I will say I also started writing the book around 2020, and at the time I would say I'm writing a book on reality TV, and they would go, oh, Trump, and I was like, that's not the whole subject. Like, it's about a genre, and there's a bunch of different things. But I didn't expect that when the book came out, the last chapter, which has a lot of grim stories in it, and also some really, to me, inspiring stories, like the voice of Kwame, sorry, I'm blanking names. I'm so sorry. He was the runner-up on that season, and he was one of the first people to speak out against Trump, like when Trump ran. He was the black runner-up on the season, and he and several other people of color who had been on that show gave a press conference. None of the white cast members spoke up initially. It was like 5 or 6 of them, and he went on television and he said everything that was going to happen, and nobody listened to him. So there's elements of that show where you can talk about people showing some kind of courage, but I have to say, it's a dark shadow that I think hangs over the entire genre. But there are other like political things about reality television as well. Some of them, like that I could talk about. Like I have to say, I do sort of hate talking about The Apprentice. It feels.
Okay, well, let's talk about a show that you actually enjoyed talking about, which is American Family, which debuted in the early 70s, just as Watergate was happening, people were kind of losing faith in institutions, but it still really valorized an idea of American life that was suburban, upper middle class, generally, safe and calm. And the American Family, which you want to explain a little bit about?
Well, I don't know whether older people may be familiar with American Family, which came out in 1973. It is an outliner on these shows. It was created by PBS, and it was a documentary about the Loud family in Santa Barbara, California. And the political thing to me about this show is actually that PBS was known for making boring documentaries about important political subjects. Like, it was eat your spinach kind of TV. And they decided that they wanted to make something more exciting. So they made this demented, they took 7 months to film this cinema verite documentary about a family, and the idea was, this is how we're going to speak about politics. By tracing this family, we're going to have stuff about the Vietnam War, we're going to have stuff about culture clashes, about the youth bust, about drugs, all of these kinds of things. And what they captured on the show were stories about a woman, Pat Loud, asking her husband for a divorce on the show, and then the presence of their oldest child in the family, Lance Loud, who was a flamboyant, hilarious, hugely charismatic gay man who was living in the Chelsea Hotel, kind of an artist and a Warhol follower, who was unlike anyone else who'd ever been on TV. And the show became a scandal. Like, it was created as a documentary, but it was received as a reality show. And the Louds became the first reality stars. And I have to say, like, as political as The Apprentice is in very obvious and dangerous ways, there are other reality shows that I also feel have a huge political impact. I think Lance Loud's presence on television really sort of set into motion a wave of acknowledgement of gay men specifically as public presences, and actually sort of triggered a certain kind of queerness throughout the reality genre. And even the sight of a woman asking for a divorce on TV was a deeply political issue in 1973. But the main thing that happened was that people judged the Louds, hated the Louds, loved the Louds, and it kind of set off the phenomenon of the reality star who is a non-famous person who unaccountably becomes famous and then becomes a kind of target and mirror for everybody's anxieties about power.
You had one of your people you ever described reality TV as being caught in the act of being yourself.
Yeah, having fun.
Yes, which I think in this case, you also talked in the book about how some of the turmoil that reality TV stars faced was part of what made it appealing. that made them seem more,
Well, I mean, because this is a panel about what's real and what's fake, and I think everybody knows that reality television as a genre is part real and part fake. And some shows became increasingly fake over time. And the point at which the book ends is the point to me at which people just started performing themselves in certain ways. But I do think the appeal of the genre is because it puts pressure on people. People watching these shows from the beginning were looking for this vibrating moment of authenticity where a person couldn't control themselves. That's why these shows are designed this way. And even in a show that's very contrived, there are moments in the show that just feel recognizably and undeniably authentic. And I think that's why people watch. I don't know, like there's so much to say about what's real and what's fake, but I think sometimes because there's so many ethical problems with the genre, there's so many, biased and cruel things about it, for viewers it's easier to just say it's all fake. Who cares what happens to these people? It's all phony. But I don't know. I think people are more vulnerable within these shows than a lot of viewers are willing to acknowledge.
well, I think along those lines, a lot of people think that they're very confident in determining what's real and what's fake. And so if you were going to ask the Kyle a question, if we're going to talk about the political impacts that all these things have, algorithmic recommendations certainly determine a lot of the way people think about politics because you get your own views reflected back to you. But another thing, and you wrote about this, I think, in the last year, people really trust search results as being an arbiter of whether something's real or not. And, when the anti-vaxxer movement really accelerated in the last couple of years, part of what drove it was that if you were looking for vaccine information, the stuff that would come up on Google and YouTube, the highest would be anti-vaxxer stuff. So how do you parse that in terms of...
It's tough. I mean, I think the internet over the past decade or two has become more overtaken by these algorithmic filtering systems. So, and the systems themselves have become worse as people adapt to them. I feel like that's a big theme of the book and our internet experience. It's like you can put a system into place and it can work really well for a while. But if too many people figure out how to game that system or adapt what they do to it, then it's going to get worse and worse. And you're kind of always outrunning the best actors or the worst actors and trying to make something that is more real than it is fake. And that's kind of what Google search has had to do for decades. And what we saw with misinformation is that the SEO optima, or the SEO people, the practitioners of search engine optimization, got really good at figuring out what exactly Google was looking for, what the Google search algorithm prioritized. And so they were better than the people who actually knew what they were talking about at just hitting the right variables and designing their article or their page or their post on social media to get that prioritization and the extra distribution. So they would show up at the top of search results. It would be the most popular TikTok video or the thing that went viral on X. And it's like there's no neutral state of that system. There's no just perfect algorithm that will give you reality or give you the thing that's true. It's just a series of variables that you choose. And I think, particularly on social media feeds, the variable that's always most important is just engagement. It's what's getting clicked on, what's popular becomes more and more popular. And so if people are clicking on misinformation, or if they're really engaging a lot with problematic political views or AI-generated content or anything that's false or faked, then that is what's going to float to the top of this system. Because there's no variable in there that's like truth or accuracy. It's just about what is getting clicked on.
So you're saying capitalistic incentives might produce some bad outcomes?
Yes, definitely. And that's become more and more of a problem online lately, I think. It's kind of a truism now that Google search sucks. Like there's a lot of bad stuff in there. You don't often get good results in the top of your list. But it wasn't always that way. I think if we go back a decade or 15 years, it worked a lot more efficiently. The internet felt like a more navigable and accurate place. It felt more real, maybe. And now we have this kind of simulacrum in which all of digital content online is so shaped to fit into these filtering systems that it becomes not very human anymore, not very organic. You see that in any kind of web page that's trying to do SEO. the long blurbs in front of recipes that everyone likes to complain about on food blogs, those posts are so long, there's so much text on them, because Google rewards that length of text because it's supposed to be a sign of authority or a good resource on the subject, even though what you're getting in reality is like, 3,000 words of bad memoir in front of your recipe for squash soup. And that's like not a human or efficient
16 crappy ads.
Yes, yeah, more and more ads. Like the incentives are to get the attention of the filtering systems and to bombard everyone who lands on your site with as many monetization mechanisms as possible. And like we've reached the ultimate point of that internet, as you well know.
Now, so you also talk about how capitalistic incentives kind of perverted the way that we understand reality. You talk also about unpaid labor that Black creators do in order to help people understand the reality of the situation. How do you think about the way that, for instance, algorithms interact with the things that you're talking about?
I mean, I guess the first thing is thinking about in terms of SEO, I'm speaking as an art historian, right? So kind of from a different perspective entirely, but the way in which artists have begun to engage SEO as a strategy to move some of their creative work through different lines of visibility is really critical, and has been an actual turn in events, I would say, and just thinking about how people create space for different types of discourse and dialogue. And there have been artists. There's an artist, literally with the name American Artist, who changed their name so that they then, when people search American Artist, find a different type of artist. And I think that's really amazing and inspiring in a lot of ways, because this is a Black artist who has thought very strategically about all the failures of art history, and the fact that when folks look up American artists, they are seeing a lot of dead white men, and that perhaps needs to be transformed. And lo and behold, American Artists has continued to grow in their brilliant work, and is one of the first hits when you search American Artists. When we think about Black Meme, the kind of SEO question also was something that I certainly was not shying away from. It was kind of interesting to me that when folks search for Black Meme, that a lot of very problematic content, some of which is virulently racist, shows up inside of search engines, and within that, right, that asking questions about how to kind of subvert that or create a different norm for learning and exchange becomes very critical. So now when you look up Black Meme, this is a different type of hit. But what I'll say, in terms of thinking of the economies around it, that also aspects of these platforms are ones that have been predicated on other platforms. And when we think about the history even of something like TikTok, the precursor to TikTok, or one of many precursors, was Vine. And Vine was a platform that became very popular because Black people were using it, and it was a space where many Black people were engaging as a kind of performance material, as a site of communication. But the economy of it couldn't sustain itself, and it collapsed. We have to ask ourselves, why is it then that TikTok now has become so massively popular? What does it mean then to think through these different enclosures and kind of counter enclosures as a proposition for Black people, kind of content creators, to take over a platform and then have that actually shift the economy of the platform entirely in terms of viewership? And to kind of take it one step further, to think about kind of modes of reality, it also, I think, is an important question to ask about, what does it mean when folks are producing material that goes into these engines, increasing their visibility and, kind of their net worth, if you will, in relation to their circulation and virality online, but that actually folks are dispossessed economically away from their screens, right? So they're not actually able to create a living. These materials then go off in a million different directions, reality TV and otherwise, right, where folks pick up on those trends and then begin to create economies around them set apart from their origin sites and without citation, right? So these are again, problems that predate the internet as we now know it, right? Thinking about questions of kind of royalties and kind of copy norms as well. Exactly.
Yeah, along those lines, Kyle, you've written a little bit about TikTok as kind of a thing that appropriates certain techniques from things like reality TV or professionalization of people who are doing videos as creators. Is that part of what drove TikTok's success, and how do you see it changing now?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I really liked about Legacy's book, at least one of many things, was how often it proved that the person who innovates on something, or the person who first creates a strategy that gets successful, on these platforms is most often not the person who benefits the most from it.
That's right.
Like we think that, oh, when someone comes up with a great meme or a great new format or a way to shoot video, that they win, that they get the reward from that innovation, and it's so rarely the case. But I think like TikTok, how I've been thinking about like the evolution of these platforms, I think is that they're more and more multimedia. Like we were on Facebook sharing little posts about our lives and like photos of parties, and then we were on Instagram taking photos in real time and sharing them. And we're like slowly turning more of our lives into content. And TikTok has been like the turbocharged vehicle for your life as content, because you're shooting video, you're shooting audio, you are making every aspect of that really social. There's even live streaming on TikTok. So it has this way of commodifying, or being able to commodify your entire existence. And like you can perform your life as content with only the equipment of a phone, which is something that everyone has access to, or very many people have access to. So I think humanity almost rushes to fill the container. Like a big lesson in my book, I think, is that the format determines the content. Like the container that a digital platform makes dictates what kinds of content people fill it with and what becomes popular. So TikTok is a space in which you can broadcast video, you can record yourself, you can put your face up there. So suddenly that's what's demanded of all of us. Like we're all suddenly making videos of ourselves. Instead of tweeting our articles as journalists, we're filming ourselves explaining what's in them. And that's the multimedia evolution of that is so crazy to me.
You did your camera tonight.
Yes.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to do a Q&A. So all three of you in your books on a somewhat optimistic note, while also saying we don't have to live like this. There are better ways to live. And I love that, in your book you quoted Gwendolyn Brooks' poem that says, I conduct a computer does not conduct me. Kyle has a quote from David Graeber that says the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that something we make is that the world is something we make, we could just as easily make it differently.
Did you find something optimistic about it?
Well, in terms of agency, yes. It's just that, we've made these things that have many downsides, but we can change them still. So when you think about the field of reality TV and the benefits of it and the downsides, what would you recommend prescriptively for people who are looking at the medium and thinking about how to make it healthier or better for consumers?
I don't really have arguments for how to make the genre better as an industry and better for consumers. The one thing that I do feel strongly about is that there's something very positive about what's happening in terms of labor and legalities in reality TV. During the entire history that I traced, there were essentially no protections for anyone in the industry on either side of the camera. And part of what runs through the book is a failed attempt to unionize reality laborers like producers who are still, it's a largely non-unionized industry, although there's been some improvement for editors and people like that. But in the book, I trace the attempt to unionize with the WGA that failed at the turn of the century, and the way in which these shows were able to keep going essentially because there were no protections, and because they were non-unionized, and because they could keep the budgets low. But just in the last few years, and really while I've been writing this book, there have been some gestures in terms of crew members, but there's finally been some attempt to talk about rights for cast members. And this seems very meaningful to me. This is not in the book, but I wrote a more investigative piece about the show Love is Blind that some of you might have seen, like the show, my piece, although maybe. It's a show that has a long history, actually. It's one of those dating shows where people are divided by a wall, except that it's a much more extreme version of this. That goes back to radio. There were shows like that on radio. Anyway, in the show, people flirt for 10 days across a wall, and then they get engaged at the end of the 10 days. And then they go on vacation, and then they go back to their hometowns, and they get legally married. So it's a really emotionally extreme show. It got very popular during the pandemic. And there are a lot of lawsuits associated with it now. And they attempt to address a subject that literally during the entire period that I'm writing about, nobody talked about it at all. One of them is the contracts that people sign for these shows, which have such extreme non-disclosure agreements that it's not just that people are not able to talk to spoil the show, they can't talk about any way in which it was made. They can't talk about the relationship between producers and cast members, the kind of manipulation that goes on, nothing. They're just not allowed to. And that's bad to me on the legal front, but also because those stories are interesting and I think it's useful for people to understand that. The other thing is that if abuse or exploitation happens at another level, they're forced into private arbitration. So right now, there's a move to change those contracts, but they're also like the first glimmers of an attempt to organize cast members. And in the book, I actually talk about several sort of failed attempts of solidarity among cast members. Over and over again, cast members would unite against the producers and try to tank the show, and it would not succeed. With a single exception, it was a strange little show that's off the map. The problem is that people who appear on reality shows are in a category that in Hollywood is called bona fide amateur, which means they're not like scripted cast members that can be part of SAG, and they're also not unscripted cast members like hosts who also can have protections. They're specifically set up to have zero protections. So I think the more educated reality viewers are about these circumstances, the more there will be a voice in solidarity with the people on the shows that they love. And that's the main thing that I think can be improved. It's really not about the artistry and craft of the shows, it's about just the humanity of the workplace. Because when I was writing this book, I realized it's the story of a genre, it's the story of technological shifts, like all of television is, but it's also the story of the invention of a kind of workplace that had never existed before. And that's the one thing where I think you can be hopeful that once people are more educated about this, and hopefully once there's some better legal decisions in California, people who go on these shows will actually be able to be protected from the worst of what reality can do.
Kyle, what are you optimistic about? And also, how do we wade through the amazing amount of algorithmic stuff that's flattening culture? What are your recommendations for people who are delusional?
I do feel like my book was hopeful in the end, or I hope it was hopeful, and I think I kind of bombarded myself with algorithmic content for the 3 years of writing the book, which is not an experience I would recommend to anyone. But what I found was that, I mean, the pendulum has shifted a little bit. Like, as we were talking about before, algorithms have a history. They were not always so prevalent online. There was this moment in 2015, 2016 where platforms became more algorithmic, added more recommendations. But I think we've kind of passed peak algorithmic recommendation, if I had to guess. And even as I was writing the book, I noticed that there was more and more anti-algorithmic sentiment, that people were getting more frustrated, they had more boredom or ennui with what they were seeing online. And we've kind of experienced how deadening or flattening or whatever these systems are. So I think people want something different. There's a clear desire for an internet that works differently and rewards more interesting forms of content, maybe more sustainable forms of content. But it's not built yet. Like there's no answer to a perfect platform. There are smaller ones. There's smaller systems like Patreon or Substack or streaming platforms like the Criterion Channel that are offering, like, to me, what is a better way of accessing culture online, and it's more original, more creative, more interesting, more rewarding. And people are slowly moving into those spaces, but it's going to take a few more years. And we're not going to get up to Facebook scale again, I hope. Like, these are platforms for 10 million people rather than a billion people.
So Lacey, you have some more specific prescriptions at the end of your book, particularly when it comes to compensating artists and cultural reparations.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess what's most important is that I feel highly optimistic about the next generation of folks who are rising up in the use of some of these platforms with a greater sense of awareness than ever before. If you want to laugh really hard, you should look up some of the testimony around TikTok and laugh cry. by, because it is really amazing to see that the spaces are essentially full of people who don't really understand how these platforms work, who are interrogating them as being sites of risk and intrigue, but perhaps as well have not grown up online, and so there's a huge gap in terms of how the actual knowledge is being applied. And what we need is the next generation of thinkers, folks who are across a wide variety of backgrounds and perspectives, who can show up to participate in the conversations and lead them, and also create kind of new frameworks of what copyright and economy needs to look like. So that is the thing that I'm most optimistic about, is kind of timing out an old guard that is very insistent on ideals that actually may not apply to the accelerated medium of the internet as we know it now, and so needs a different set of innovations.
Okay, I'm heavily tasked with keeping us on time, so I think we have time for one question. Yes.
Very interested in two words and phrases that came up, and also in sort of addressing the tail of the talk. So one of the words is Kyle's neutrality in our movement, and the other is reality audience that Emily used. And so I'm wondering, in your research, we can go back to the title of this talk, which is what is reality, and each of you could answer that within thinking about your research and the panel as a whole.
So just answer what is reality.
No big deal.
I mean, I think my perception of reality after writing the book, I suppose it was just to notice that how much our perception of reality, or the dominant fact of reality, was created by the feeds that we consume things through. So I think I really felt the influence of algorithmic recommendations and understood how that created the reality that has to be lived, particularly for artists and consumers. So in this field of culture, like an illustrator on Instagram is living in an algorithmic reality. They have to contend with this thing all the time. If you are trying to seek out a book to consume or music to listen to, then you are also contending with an algorithmic reality. So it's not that the reality itself has become more algorithmic and is more mediated by algorithms than it was ever before.
Well, I'm not sure how to respond to it, although I will say one of the things I really felt while writing this book is that even on some particularly cool shows, there was a part of me that was very sympathetic with the audience's desire to see themselves and genuine emotions reflected on screen. I think that there's a lot of shows in which this is a very radical thing, just to see emotions that are not feigned. And sometimes this means on these shows putting people under pressure. And so I had a lot of ambivalence about the genre as I went, because there were shows where the most liberating things about them were simultaneously the most disturbing or oppressive. And the conclusion that I came to ultimately was that in a strange way, the faker a show was, the more ethical it was. And the more authentic and the more raw and more vulnerable a show was, the more open it was to hurting people. And I think that that is the difficulty of talking about reality, because people want these shows to be, in a meaningful way, an expression of actual human behavior, of love and fear, and like the powerful things people get out of shows like Survivor. But it essentially, it doesn't work until we also pay attention to the system within which these things are produced. And I think that's sort of an unsolvable problem. I don't know if that's an answer to the question.
I mean, it's a vast question, but I would say most simply that I think folks need to seek out different models of truth. We spend a lot of time to this point of kind of seeing our devices and other technologies as mirrors rather than seeing them as opportunities to engage in different channels of broadcast. As kind of looking at ourselves or looking for ourselves or our core interests. And I think it's really important to work against maybe some of the algorithmic assumptions, to seek out channels that actually you wouldn't seek out, and to identify where those things may or may not align with your own personal set of beliefs. That for me, I think, is most urgent, just because regardless of what your position is on a wide variety of topics, understanding where other intersections occur, and also as well why you believe those things can only occur when you're kind of up against things maybe that you've not seen before or encountered. And so to deepen in ourselves is to not just look at a mirror, but to spend time looking outward So that will be my great call to presence, is to think about, how can reality be established and shaped by us recognizing other understandings of truths, and where does that create a meeting place for us as we evolve forward?
Thank you all. This has been a great panel.